The moment Elara Voss stumbled through the door of the mountain man's cabin with frostbitten fingers and a dying horse behind her, he told her she had two choices: stay or die out there, and she had hated him for being right. The year was 1874, and the Wyoming Territory was not a place that forgave weakness. The Teton Range stretched its jagged spine across the horizon like the backbone of some enormous sleeping beast, white-capped and indifferent to the struggles of the small lives moving in its shadow. The trails that wound through the foothills were unpredictable in the best months. In October, when the first serious storms rolled down from the north and buried the passes under 3 feet of snow in less than a day, those trails became something else entirely. They became graves. Elara had not intended to be anywhere near the mountains when winter arrived. She had been traveling from Cheyenne, heading northwest toward a small mining settlement called Callow Creek, where her older brother, Thomas, had staked a claim the previous spring and written her enthusiastic letters about the silver he was certain lay just beneath the earth's surface. She had sold everything she owned in Ohio after their mother passed: the small house, the furniture, even the china that had crossed the Atlantic with their grandmother, and had used the money to book passage west on the Union Pacific, and then to purchase a decent mare and enough supplies to make the last leg of the journey overland. She was 24 years old, college-educated in a time when that meant something unusual for a woman, and she had made the mistake that educated people sometimes make, which is to confuse knowing about a thing with knowing the thing itself. She knew, intellectually, that Wyoming winters were severe. She had read about them. She had spoken to men in Cheyenne who described the storms that came off the mountains, and she had listened carefully, and she had nodded, and then she had looked at her calendar and determined that she had at least 3 weeks before conditions could deteriorate to the point of genuine danger. What she had not accounted for was the particular cruelty of the autumn of 1874, which had decided to arrive 6 weeks early and with unusual violence. The storm hit on her third day out of Cheyenne. It began as a gray haze on the northern horizon at mid-morning, moved in with alarming speed, and by early afternoon had turned the world white and directionless. Her mare, a reliable chestnut named Clara, had managed another 4 hours before the cold and the snow and the sheer exhaustion of breaking trail through drifts that reached her chest had finally broken her. The mare had gone lame in the right foreleg, and Elara had dismounted and tried to lead her forward, and the horse had refused, and the snow had kept falling, and the temperature had kept dropping, and the light had begun to fail. That was when she had seen the cabin. It sat in a shallow draw below a ridge of pines, barely visible through the snow, its single window throwing a dim orange square of light into the white darkness. She had left Clara in the lee of the tree line, where there was at least partial shelter, promising the horse she would return, and she had walked the last 200 yards to the door and knocked on it with numb, clumsy hands. The man who opened it was not what she had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected exactly. He filled the doorframe completely, not just in height, though he was well over 6 feet, but in the sheer breadth of him, the width of his shoulders, the density of his presence. He wore a heavy flannel shirt rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and the forearms it revealed were corded with muscle, browned from a lifetime outdoors, marked with the small white scars that accumulated on a man who worked with his hands and his body every day of his life. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, slightly wavy, pushed back from a face that was all strong angles, a jaw like a cliff edge, dark eyes that assessed her with immediate unflinching attention, and a beard that was neither trimmed nor wild, but simply the natural result of a man who spent most of his time far from barbers. He looked at her for about 3 seconds, taking in the snow-crusted coat, the shaking hands, the blue tinge at her lips, and his expression shifted from the hard wariness of a man interrupted to something that was not quite softness, but was the precursor to it. "My horse," she said, and her voice came out strange and thin. "She's lame, in the trees at the top of the draw." "Get inside," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not raise it because he had never needed to. "I need to see to my horse first." "Get inside." He said it again, exactly the same way, and then he stepped past her into the storm, and she stood in the open doorway watching his broad back disappear into the white dark without another word. She went inside. The cabin was small and dense with warmth, built from heavy logs chinked with clay, its single room dominated by a stone fireplace against the far wall where a fire burned with serious practical heat. There was a rope bed in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves of supplies, dried goods, oil, tools, traps, and the smell of wood smoke and pine resin and something animal and clean, like a man who worked hard and was comfortable with it. Elara peeled off her outer coat with fingers that barely cooperated and stood before the fire and felt the warmth hit her like a physical blow, almost painful against the cold that had settled into her skin. She was still standing there, trembling finely, when the door opened behind her and the mountain man came back in trailing snow, her saddlebag slung over one shoulder and her rifle under his arm. He set both down near the door and shook the snow from his hair like a man utterly accustomed to weather. "Your mare is in the lean-to around back," he said, moving to the fire and hanging his coat on a hook. "I cleared enough space, there's hay." "Is she? She'll live if she rests the leg. Can't say what she'll be like to ride." He looked at Elara directly again. "You're half frozen." "I'm fine." Something moved in his eyes that might have been the barest shadow of amusement. "You're not fine. Sit down." She sat because her legs were in fact no longer entirely reliable, and he moved around the cabin with the economy of motion that characterized everything he did, pulling a tin mug from a shelf, pouring something from a pot that had been sitting on the hearth, bringing it to her without ceremony. It was coffee, or something that had been coffee at one point and had since become an argument, dense and black and scalding. "Thank you," she said. He pulled the second chair close to the fire and sat in it, forearms on his knees, and looked at the flames. He was not looking at her, but she had the sense of being observed nonetheless, the way you could feel a man's attention even when his eyes were elsewhere. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Callow Creek. My brother has a claim there." A brief pause. "Callow Creek is another 4 days of riding in good conditions. In this storm, in this cold, those conditions don't exist." "I know that now." "You should have known it before you left Cheyenne." The coffee was bracing enough that she felt a flicker of actual feeling return to her extremities, and with it came a flicker of her natural temperament, which was neither timid nor easily managed. "I appreciate the advice, though I believe the timing of it is somewhat past its usefulness." He looked at her then. The firelight moved across the strong planes of his face, and she had the uncomfortable awareness that he was not merely a large and capable man, but an interesting one, that behind those dark, level eyes there was more going on than the immediate practical assessments of survival. "You're welcome to stay until the storm breaks," he said. "After that, I'll show you the route to Callow Creek. The direct trail will be impassable. There's a lower route that runs through Bent Hollow and cuts north. Longer, but possible." "How long until the storm breaks?" He looked back at the fire. "Day after tomorrow, maybe 3 days. This one has weight to it." Elara looked around the small, single-room cabin. "Where will I sleep?" "The bed. I'll take the floor." "I can't take your bed." "You can, and you will." He said it with the same flat finality he applied to everything, a man not accustomed to negotiating the terms of basic practicality. "You need to get warm. The floor won't accomplish that." She wanted to argue but did not, because she was honest enough to recognize that arguing would be stubbornness for its own sake. "What's your name?" she asked instead. "Caleb Holt." "Elara Voss." He nodded once as though filing this away. "You from the East?" "Ohio, originally." "College?" She looked at him surprised. "Yes, Oberlin. How did you know?" "The way you talk, and the way you read the situation wrong. Educated people do that sometimes. They trust their knowledge more than the land." There was no cruelty in the observation. It was simply stated, a thing he had observed to be true. "And where are you from, Caleb Holt, that you know what the land requires?" Something shifted in his jaw. "Everywhere," he said after a moment, "and here." It was not an answer designed to invite further questions, and she recognized the deliberate flatness of it as a closed door. She did not push. She was cold and tired and grateful for the fire and the coffee, and she was 24 years old in a Wyoming snowstorm in a stranger's cabin, and she was not so far removed from common sense as to make enemies of her situation. She slept in his bed that night, under 2 heavy wool blankets that smelled of pine and smoke, and she slept with the depth of a person who has been genuinely afraid and is no longer, and outside the storm howled against the log walls like something that wanted in and did not get in. Caleb woke before dawn, as he always did. He moved to the fire and built it up without making noise, a man practiced in the particular consideration of not disturbing others in a small space, a skill acquired in circumstances he did not care to revisit at length. He made coffee and sat with it in the dark cabin, the fire throwing shadows against the walls, and he was aware in a way he could not quite suppress of the woman sleeping 10 feet away. He was 30 years old. He had been in these mountains for 6 years, by choice, and then by something deeper than choice, which was the settled certainty that this was where he belonged. He had come west from Missouri after the war. He had been a boy of 15 when the fighting started, old enough to understand what was happening, and young enough to be marked by it in ways that did not entirely heal. And he had spent years moving through the territory, trapping and guiding and doing the kind of work that required strength and endurance and the willingness to be alone. 3 years ago, he had built this cabin. He had not been lonely in it exactly. Loneliness required an expectation of company, and Caleb had largely stopped expecting company. He watched the gray light come through the single window and listened to the storm and drank his coffee and tried not to think about the woman in his bed and failed at the last of those 3 things with a consistency that he found irritating. She was not what he had expected when he had opened the door and found her standing in the storm. He had expected fear or helplessness or the kind of fragile dependency that made a man feel both needed and slightly burdened. What he had found instead was someone who was afraid and knew she was afraid and was angry about it, someone whose first words had been about her horse and not about herself, someone who had pushed back at him even when she was shaking and blue-lipped, and then had had the intelligence to stop pushing when it mattered. He had guided enough people through this country to know that the ones who survived were not necessarily the strongest or the bravest, but the ones who could accurately assess when to fight and when to submit to circumstances, and that was a rarer quality than it sounded. He made breakfast when she stirred, salt pork and cornbread cooked in the skillet, and set it on the table, and she came to the table with her hair undone from whatever it had been in the night before and hanging over one shoulder in a dark wave, and she looked at the food and then at him and said, "Thank you," with a directness that was neither performative nor obligatory, but simply honest. They ate without speaking much. The storm continued outside. After a while she asked if she could check on her horse, and he said yes, but to take his coat since hers was still damp. And she had put on his coat, which fell nearly to her knees, and wrapped around her twice, and gone out to the lean-to, and he had watched her through the window without meaning to, this small, determined figure in his enormous coat, navigating the snow to the lean-to without any of the tentative uncertainty he might have expected, just purpose and forward movement. She came back in pink-cheeked and snow-dusted and said that Clara was standing on all 4 legs and eating the hay and looked considerably better, and there was a relief in her voice so genuine that it rearranged his chest slightly. "She's a good horse," Elara said, hanging his coat back on the hook and coming to warm her hands at the fire. "She is," he agreed. "She had sense enough to stop when she was done. Not every horse does. Not every person does either." He looked at her. She was looking at her own hands, turning them over near the heat. "Some days I think Clara has more sense than I do," she added, and the self-awareness in it, the complete absence of self-pity, made something in him ease a small degree. "What will you do at Callow Creek?" he asked. "Once you get to your brother?" She straightened slightly and settled into the second chair. "Help him. He writes that the work is considerable for one man, and I have some practical skills. I can cook and I can keep accounts and I know how to work hard. I'm not under any illusions that it will be comfortable." "What made you come out here instead of staying in Ohio?" She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense of watching someone decide how much truth to put into an answer. "There was nothing left in Ohio," she said finally. "My mother died in the spring. She was the last of it, the last reason to stay. Thomas wrote the letter about the claim right around that time, and it seemed like the answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking." "What question?" "What happens next?" She said it simply, looking at the fire. "I suppose I'm still in the process of finding out." The second day of the storm was, in some ways, more difficult than the first, because the first had been about survival and practicality, and the second had no such clear organizing principle. The snow continued. The wind continued. The cabin was too small for two people who did not know each other to move around in without a constant, low-level awareness of the other person's presence. Caleb was a man whose days were structured by physical work, and the enforced inactivity of a blizzard was always fractionally maddening. He sharpened tools that did not need sharpening, and checked his trap lines that were, of course, buried under several feet of snow and could not actually be checked, and eventually he sat at the table and worked on a piece of leather harness that needed mending. Elara, for her part, did not appear to require entertainment or distraction. She had found a book in her saddlebag, a small, battered copy of something he couldn't read the spine of from where he sat, and she read it with the focused attention of someone who had been reading seriously since childhood, occasionally reaching up to turn a page with the unconscious automaticity of genuine absorption. Once she laughed at something and then glanced up with the slightly self-conscious look of a person who has made noise they didn't intend to in someone else's space. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. I'm sorry. The book there's a character in it who reminds me of you a little." He set down the harness. "What character?" "A very large man who tells people what to do and means well about it." She looked back at the book. "He's quite likable by the end." He did not know exactly what to do with that, so he picked the harness back up and said nothing. But he noticed that the silence between them had changed quality slightly, had become less the silence of two strangers and more the silence of two people who had begun to establish a particular way of being around each other, with its own small vocabulary of looks and pauses. That evening, he cooked venison stew from the meat he had put up at the beginning of autumn, and she asked him while they ate about the mountains, not the polite conversational questions of a person making small talk, but the specific, concentrated questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand the place she was in. How did the game move with the seasons? How did you read the weather from the mountain itself, independent of the sky? What grew at what elevation and why? He answered at length, which surprised him, since he was not generally a man who spoke at length about anything. But her questions were good questions, which is to say they came from real curiosity and not from the desire to fill space, and real curiosity made him want to answer. At one point, she leaned forward with her elbows on the table, completely absorbed in something he was explaining about the way the deer moved down out of the high country in late September, and her expression was so unguarded and intent that he stopped speaking mid-sentence. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." He cleared his throat. "Where was I?" On the third morning, the storm broke. He woke at his usual hour and stepped outside, and the world had gone still and absolute, the sky a hard, clear blue above a landscape transformed utterly by the snow. The Tetons rose to the west in crystalline, impossible sharpness, the kind of clarity that only existed after a major storm had scrubbed the air clean. He stood in the snow outside the cabin door and breathed the cold air and felt what he always felt after a storm, which was something very close to reverence. He heard the door behind him, and she came to stand beside him, her own coat now dry and on her own shoulders, and she looked at the mountains and did not say anything for a long moment. "Oh," she said at last. It was soft and involuntary and absolutely genuine. "I didn't. In the photographs, it doesn't look like that." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They stood there side by side in the snow and the silence, and the cold air moved between them, and neither of them moved away from it. Over breakfast he explained the route to Callow Creek, the lower trail through Bent Hollow that ran north along the river before cutting up through a lower pass that would be difficult, but passable. 4 days of careful riding, possibly 5 with Clara's legs still healing. He had a second horse, a large gray gelding named Drum that he used for packing, and he said without preamble that he would ride with her to Callow Creek. "That's not necessary," she said immediately. "The route goes through country I know, and you don't. The trail markers will be buried. You won't find the path without someone who knows where to look." "I could find it." "You could not." He said it without heat, simply the truth. "There are 3 places where the trail splits and nothing visible to tell you which branch to take. I've ridden it in winter. You haven't." She looked at him with those direct brown eyes, and he could see the argument happening behind them, the same argument she had made to herself the first night about the bed. Stubbornness weighed against honest assessment. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know me." "You're here," he said. "That's sufficient." There was a pause that had something charged and warm in it, something that neither of them was ready to name. "All right," she said. "I accept. Thank you." They left the next morning, both horses packed and moving in the gray pre-dawn light. Caleb led on Drum, who was 17 hands of deliberate, patient strength, and Elara followed on Clara, who was moving on the bad leg with only a slight hesitation that would improve with the exercise. The snow was deep and the going was slow, and it required his full concentration to find the trail under the white, reading the shape of the land itself rather than any visible marking. He found himself, through the first hours of riding, becoming accustomed to the sound of her behind him, the creak of her saddle, the occasional soft word to her horse, the complete absence of complaint about the cold or the difficulty of the terrain. He had guided people who spent entire days narrating their discomfort, and the silence of a person who understood that difficulty was simply the condition and not worthy of constant comment was something he had come to value deeply. They stopped at midday in a stand of aspens out of the wind, ate from the provisions he'd packed, dried venison, hardtack, dried apple, and she asked him about the war. He didn't know what had made her ask it, perhaps something in the way he'd moved through the woods that morning, a kind of vigilance that was shaped by something older than the mountains. He told her the abbreviated version he told everyone, which was that he had been young and it had been bad, and he had come west afterward. But something about the way she listened, not filling the space with sympathy or political observation, but simply hearing him, made him add more than he usually did. He told her about Missouri, about what the war had been in a border state where everyone was on every side at once and nothing was clean, about his father who had survived the fighting and not survived the peace. He told her about coming west at 19 with a rifle and a horse and not much else, and learning the mountains the way you learned a difficult book, slowly and with repeated failures. "You built the cabin yourself," she said. It was not a question. "Every log." "Why there? That particular spot?" He thought about it. No one had ever asked him that specific question. "The draw faces south," he said. "Gets winter light, and there's a spring 20 yards uphill that runs clean year-round, and the ridge behind it breaks the north wind." He paused. "And the view of the range from the door it's a good view." "It is," she said, and something in her voice told him she had already understood that the view was not a minor consideration. They made camp that first night in a rocky overhang he knew from previous crossings, a place where the rock curved overhead enough to keep the worst of the cold off while they slept. He built a fire at the overhang's lip, and it reflected heat back from the stone above efficiently. She helped with the camp without needing to be told what to do, observing what he was doing and working alongside it rather than waiting for instruction, and he found the competence of it quietly striking. After the horses were seen to, and the fire was established, and the night had settled in around them with its profound mountain silence, they sat with their tin cups and the fire between them, and she asked him what he actually did, day to day, in those mountains. Not what he had done to arrive there, but what his life looked like now. So he told her. The trapping season from November through February, the pelts he sold in Cheyenne in early spring, the way that money funded the supplies for the rest of the year, the summer hunting and the work he occasionally did, guiding survey parties or supply trains through the passes, the way the cabin needed continual maintenance against the weather, the rhythm of a life built around what the land required rather than around any external calendar. "Do you like it?" she asked, not in the polite way, but with real intention. "Yes," he said, and meant it with a simplicity that came from not having thought to question it in years. "Are you ever lonely?" The fire crackled between them. He looked at it. "Sometimes," he said after a pause that was honest. "Less than you might think." "More than you let yourself feel, probably," she said quietly, and there was no challenge in it, just an observation, and the accuracy of it landed somewhere in his chest with a small, precise weight that he did not immediately know what to do with. They slept on opposite sides of the fire, wrapped in bedrolls, and the horses shifted and breathed in the dark around them, and the stars above the overhang were extraordinary in their number and brightness, and Caleb lay awake for a while, looking at them and trying to make sense of the feeling that had been building in him over these 3 days with steady insistence, like a river coming up. The second day of riding brought them down out of the foothills and into the Bent Hollow country, where the river ran under its skin of ice and the cottonwoods stood leafless and silver along the banks. The landscape here was more open, the snow less deep where the river bottom had sheltered it, and their pace improved. Elara had been riding more easily, her body having remembered how to work with the landscape rather than against it, and Caleb found himself hanging back slightly from his position at the front of their line to ride beside her rather than ahead. They talked as they rode, conversationally and at length, which was unusual enough for him that he noticed it. She told him about Oberlin. She had been one of the first women to study in the same classrooms as men, a fact which she mentioned with neither pride nor false modesty, simply as a detail, and about the intellectual life she had found there, the arguments about philosophy and politics and literature that had made her more certain of some things and considerably less certain of many others. She told him about her mother, who had been a woman of fierce and quiet intelligence, born 20 years too early for any of the doors that intelligence deserved to open, and about the particular grief of watching a person contain themselves in ways their nature never intended. "She was glad I went to Oberlin," Elara said, looking between her horse's ears at the river ahead. "She was. You could see the gladness in her even when she was trying not to show how much it cost her for me to go." A pause. "I don't think she ever believed I would actually come west." "Did you believe it?" "Not entirely, until I was actually on the train." She glanced at him. "And you? Did you always know you would come here?" "I knew I had to go somewhere," he said. West was the direction that had space in it. She smiled at that, and the smile did something to the light in her face that he was trying not to look at too directly. Late that afternoon, they stopped at a trapper's way station he knew, a small sod-roofed structure near the river that was not much more than walls and a stove and a stack of wood, but which was warm and solid and an improvement over camping in the open. While he saw to the horses, she built the fire inside without being asked, having learned the stove's temperament from watching him manage it the previous evening, and when he came in from the cold, the fire was already established and throwing good heat, and she was seated near it, unwrapping the provisions with the domestic ease of a woman who had lived practically for a long time. He stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her without intending to, the firelight on her face and her hands moving with that characteristic purposeful efficiency, and he had the sudden violent clarity of a man who has been avoiding an honest thought and finally has it. He was falling in love with her, not in the blurred, provisional way of attraction or admiration, but in the specific, particular way of one person recognizing another, recognizing the shape of their mind and the quality of their character and the precise, specific way they moved through the world, and wanting, with a conviction that felt like gravity, to be near that thing. The thought arrived with the calm shock of something inevitable, and he stood there in the doorway for perhaps 2 seconds too long, and she looked up and found him looking at her, and something in her expression shifted, a slight widening, a held breath, before she looked back down at the provisions. "Are you going to come inside or just make a door out of yourself?" she said, and her voice was slightly careful in a way it hadn't been before. He came inside and closed the door. They ate. They were quieter than they had been, but the quiet had a different quality, not the easy silence of 2 days ago, but something more charged, more aware of itself. After the meal, she asked him about the trapper who had built the way station, and he told her what he knew, which was not much, only that the man had worked this section of the river for 30 years and had gone back east at last to die, which seemed to him both sad and right in a way he could not entirely explain. "Do you think about the future?" she asked. "What yours looks like?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think about the next season," he said. "The next set of trap lines. Whether the cabin roof will need work in spring." He looked at the fire. "Further than that, I've never been much for planning." "Most of the time I planned too much," she said. "I had Thomas's claim mapped out in my head, the work we would do, what the cabin would look like, whether the silver was likely to run north or south based on the geological surveys I'd read." A slight pause. "I did not plan for the storm." "No," he said. "The land tends to object to planning." She laughed, soft and genuine, and the sound of it in the small warm room was the most comfortable thing he had heard in a very long time. On the third day, they climbed out of the bent hollow country and into the foothills north of the river, following the lower pass he had described. The trail here was genuinely difficult, steep and narrow and buried under snow that had no reference point visible within it, and he picked his way carefully, reading the fall of the land under the white, trusting the years of traversal he carried in his muscles and his memory. Clara was managing well, her leg having strengthened over the 2 days of steady movement, though he watched her gait with attention, and they stopped twice to let her rest. During the second rest, while the horses drank from a stretch of open water he knew in a crook of the trail, Elara came to stand beside him at the bank, and they stood looking at the water, moving dark and deliberate under its rim of ice. "Will you tell me about your family?" she asked. "Before Missouri, before the war." He told her. He did not usually tell people, but she had offered him her own tender things without protection, and it seemed dishonest not to match that. He told her about his mother, who had died of fever when he was 8, and his father, a farmer and a difficult man made more difficult by grief, who had raised Caleb and his younger sister Mira with a loving sternness that had calcified into something harder in the years after the war. He told her that Mira had married and was somewhere in Kansas, and that they exchanged letters occasionally, that he was an uncle to 2 nephews he had never met, which was a thing that saddened him sometimes with a particular low ache. "You should visit her," Elara said simply. "Maybe in the spring," he said, and was surprised to find that he meant it rather than just saying it. She looked at him with that steady, careful attention she gave to things that mattered. "I think you're less alone than you believe yourself to be," she said. "I think you've just gotten very practiced at not needing things." He looked at the water. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I've gotten honest about what the land can and can't give you." "And what can't it give you?" He was quiet long enough that the horses shifted behind them and the ice clicked at the water's edge. "Someone to tell things to," he said at last. "At the end of a day, someone who hears you." She did not say anything for a moment. Then, softly, "I hear you, Caleb." He looked at her. She was looking at the water. Her profile was serious and her jaw had a particular set to it, and the cold had put color in her cheeks, and she was perhaps the most real person he had been near in a very long time. Real in the specific sense of someone who did not perform themselves, who presented what they actually were rather than a considered version of it. "I know," he said, and his voice came out lower and quieter than he had intended. They rode on. The 4th day brought them out of the mountains and into the broader valley where Callow Creek sat, and the settlement appeared in the late afternoon, a scatter of rough buildings along a frozen creek, the muddy then snow-covered Main Street, the smoke from half a dozen chimneys, the sound of mining equipment muffled by distance and snow. It was smaller than Elara had imagined, he thought, watching her face as she looked at it. "It's very small," she said. "Most of them are." She straightened in the saddle. "Thomas's claim is on the North Fork. He described it as about half a mile from the main settlement." They found the claim as described, a modest cabin set against a hillside with the mine entrance framed in timber above it. The door opened before they reached it, and Thomas came out, a tall young man of perhaps 26, auburn-haired and thin in the way of someone who has been working hard and eating inadequately, and the relief on his face when he saw his sister was the uncomplicated, complete relief of a man who has been afraid and has stopped being afraid all at once. He crossed the snow to them at something close to a run, and she was off her horse before he reached her, and they embraced in the way of 2 people who share a history that they know the weight of. And Caleb sat on drum and watched them and felt the particular quiet warmth of having done a thing that mattered. Thomas looked up at him over his sister's shoulder and extended his hand. "Thomas Voss. I take it you guided her through. I owe you considerably." "Caleb Holt," he said, taking the hand. "No debt. She didn't need much guiding." Elara stepped back from her brother and looked at Caleb, and there was something in her expression that was complicated and direct, and he held it for a moment before looking away at the cabin. Thomas pressed him to stay for dinner, and then for the night, since the hour was late and the temperature was dropping again. Caleb accepted without ceremony, and they sat around Thomas's rough table that evening, eating a thick bean stew that was simple and extremely good. And Thomas told them about the claim, about the silver vein he had found and the work it required to follow, about the supply situation and the particular difficulties of winter mining, about the two other men who worked the claim with him and who would return from a supply run the following day. And Caleb watched Elara with her brother, watched the way she listened to him and asked practical questions, and began in her organized, forward-thinking way to understand the actual situation rather than the one she had imagined. And he thought about riding back to his cabin alone and was surprised by how specific and physical the prospect felt, not merely quiet, empty. In the morning, when the sky was pale gold and the snow was blue in the shadow of the hills, he prepared to leave. He brought his horse around from Thomas's small stable and was tightening the cinch when she came out of the cabin and crossed the snow to him with that particular purpose that was the signature of everything she did. "Caleb," she said. He turned. She stood in the early morning light with her arms crossed against the cold, her breath clouding between them, and she looked at him with those serious brown eyes that did not look away from difficult things. "Thank you," she said, "for the cabin and the route and for the conversation." A pause. "I mean it, all of it." "I know you mean it," he said. "Will you—" She stopped, tried again. "Callow Creek is not so far from where you are." "Day and a half," he said, "in good conditions." "In good conditions." She held his eyes. "I think I would like to know you better, Caleb Holt, if that is something you'd want too." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming sideways and golden, and it was very cold and very beautiful. And she was standing in it looking at him with the same direct, uncomplicating honesty she brought to everything. And he thought about how long it had been since someone had said a simple, true thing to him without anything else loaded into it. "I'd want that," he said. "Yes." She smiled, and it was different from her other smiles, fuller, less guarded, the smile of someone who had said something true and had it received truly. "Good," she said. "Then I'll expect you in the spring." "Before spring," he said, without having planned to, and the surprise of it moved across her face before the smile widened. He rode out of Callow Creek in the gold morning light, and he did not look back, partly because he was not a man who looked back, and partly because he was afraid that if he did, he would simply turn around, and that was not a thing to be done impulsively at the end of 4 days of a snowstorm with a woman he had known for less than a week. But the whole long ride home through the winter landscape, with the mountains white and enormous to the west and the cold air clean in his lungs, he thought about her. He thought about the way she had stood in his cabin door with her frost-bitten hands and her concern for her horse. He thought about how she had listened to him talk about deer trails and mountain weather as though it were the most important information in the world. He thought about what she had said at the way station fire, about being someone who heard him, and how the simplicity of it had moved through him like a key in a lock. He got back to his cabin on the second day, in the late afternoon, and went through the door into the empty room, and stood there for a moment in the familiar smell of wood smoke and pine resin, and felt the specific quality of the quiet that had been there before she had appeared in it. It was not enough anymore. That was the plain truth of it. The quiet that had been sufficient for 3 years was no longer sufficient, because he had spent 4 days with someone who made it insufficient, and the mountain man who had told himself for a long time that he wanted nothing more than this cabin, these mountains, this solitude, was discovering that wanting and needing and admitting to both were different things from each other, and that he had been confusing them for years. He built the fire. He made coffee. He sat in his chair by the fire and looked at the other chair, which was just a chair, and he thought about a woman who read books and asked good questions and had put on his oversized coat to check on her horse in a blizzard and said, simply and truly, that she heard him. He lasted 3 weeks. He left for Callow Creek on the 15th of November, loaded with legitimate purposes. He needed to trade pelts in the settlement, which was true, and he had a message to deliver to the assayer there from a trapper he'd encountered on his lines, which was also true. And neither of these things had anything to do with the real reason he was going, which he acknowledged to himself with something between amusement and discomfort. The settlement in November had settled into its winter rhythms. A few dozen people, mostly miners and the attendant services that mining communities required, living in varying degrees of comfort in the cold. The general store doubled as a trading post, and he conducted his legitimate business there, and then went to find Thomas's claim. He found Elara first. She was outside the cabin splitting wood, which she was doing with a technique that was incorrect and inefficient, and she had clearly been doing it for a while because there was a considerable pile of split wood, and she was sweating through the cold despite it. She had not heard him come up the hill through the snow, and he stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment watching her work, the axe coming up and coming down with the effort of someone doing something hard the hard way. "Your grip is wrong," he said. She spun around so fast she nearly dropped the axe. Her hair was loose, half-pinned, and her face was flushed from the work, and she looked at him with an expression that moved through surprise and arrived at something warmer very quickly. "Caleb Holt," she said. "Elara Voss. You said spring." "I said before spring." She looked at him for a moment, and then looked at the axe in her hands. "My grip is wrong," she repeated. "Show me." He crossed the clearing and took the axe and repositioned her hands on the handle. Her hands were small and cold and real under his, and he was very aware of the proximity and the fact that he had come 3 days through the November mountains nominally to trade pelts, and showed her the proper leverage, the way the bottom hand did the guiding while the top hand provided the initial force, the rotation of the wrists at the bottom of the stroke. She tried it. The log split cleanly. "Oh," she said, with the particular satisfaction of a physical thing done correctly. "That is better." He stepped back. She split 2 more logs with the new grip, efficiently, cleanly, and then set the axe in the chopping block and turned to look at him with her hands on her hips and the flushed, wind-blown directness of someone who had been working in the cold. "Come inside," she said. "Thomas will want to see you." Thomas did want to see him, and showed him the work that had been done on the claim since he'd arrived, a deeper cut into the hillside, a new timber frame on the mine entrance, the progress of the silver vein, which was proving to be narrower than hoped, but consistent. Caleb looked at the work with the eye of a man who had spent years in difficult country, and offered practical observations about the shoring of the tunnel walls that Thomas received with real attention. Over dinner that evening, Thomas had acquired actual beef from somewhere, a considerable luxury. The 3 of them talked about Callow Creek and its prospects, about the other miners and the small community forming around the claims, about the supply situation that would become genuinely critical if the winter continued much harder. Caleb listened and contributed, and was aware the entire time of Elara across the table, who was doing the same, but who was also, he thought, aware of him in a way that ran parallel to the conversation rather than inside it. After Thomas had turned in, he rose before dawn for the mine work and consequently went to bed early. Caleb and Elara sat by the fire alone, and the familiarity of the arrangement was striking. How quickly the weeks of his absence had collapsed into the intimacy of those 4 traveling days, as though no time had passed at all. "How are you really?" he asked. "Not the version for your brother." She looked at him and then at the fire with the particular expression of a person who has been waiting for the right question. "It's harder than I expected," she said. "Not the work. The work is fine. But the isolation is. I did not anticipate how much the quiet would accumulate." "Yes," he said. "It does that. I keep thinking of things I want to say to someone who will." She stopped. "Who will hear them," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Yes." The fire moved between them. He had his forearms on his knees in the posture she had probably already recognized as characteristic of him, and he was looking at her, and he had already passed the point where he was trying not to look. "I thought about you," he said, "after I went back, considerably." The word considerably had not been the word he'd intended to use, but she seemed to understand what it was standing in for, because something in her face opened. "I thought about you too," she said, "more than I strictly know how to account for." He reached across the space between the 2 chairs and put his hand on hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. His hand was large enough to cover hers completely, and it was a gesture so uncharacteristic of him, so unlike the contained, self-sufficient man he had been for years, that for a moment he was very still, feeling the reality of the choice in it. She turned her hand over under his and held it. They sat like that for a while, the fire talking quietly between them in the winter, working against the walls of the cabin outside. And it was, he thought, the simplest and most complete thing he had felt in a very long time. He stayed in Callow Creek for 4 days that November visit, and in those 4 days, something shifted from the tentative beginning of a feeling to the established fact of one. They took long walks in the cold mornings while Thomas worked the mine. She wore his spare coat again, not having one heavy enough for a Wyoming winter, and he was going to address that. And they talked about everything, the way two people talk when they have found someone who can keep up with them and are slightly drunk on the discovery. They talked about books and about politics and about the land, about what she had observed of the silver mining community and its particular social dynamics, about his trap lines and the ways the mountain ecology shifted from season to season. They stood at the top of the hill, above the claim one afternoon in the flat white winter light, and looked out over the valley. And she said she could see why people came here and did not leave. He said he could see why someone who arrived in a storm might not at first. And she laughed and said that she had never really considered leaving, not even when she was most afraid, and the honesty of it sat with him warmly. On the third evening, he kissed her. He had been walking her back from the general store through the main street of the settlement. She had gone for thread and needles, and he had accompanied her as a matter of the habit of accompanying her that had formed over the 4 days. And they had stopped outside the claim trail where the path met the main road, and she had been saying something about a conversation she'd had with one of the other miners' wives, and she had stopped speaking mid-sentence and looked at him with a clarity of intent that met his own completely. He kissed her with his hands on either side of her face, careful and certain, and she kissed him back with the same quality that characterized everything she did, which was complete and unhesitating once she'd decided. It was cold enough that their breath was clouding around them, and the settlement was quiet with the particular quiet of early evening, and it lasted long enough that they were both considerably warmer by the end of it than the temperature warranted. "I've been thinking about doing that," she said when they had separated somewhat, "since approximately the second day in the cabin." "I've been thinking about it longer than that," he said, "though I'm not sure I knew what I was thinking." She laughed. "You knew." "Maybe," he said, "probably." He left the next morning. He had trap lines to run and a cabin to maintain and a winter to prepare against. And she had the claim and her brother and the particular work of establishing herself in a new place, and both of them understood that the distance between their lives was real and required honest accounting. But before he left, she pressed a letter into his hand. She had written it the previous evening, she said, and he was not to read it on the trail, but to wait until he was back at the cabin. He read it at the cabin, in his chair by the fire, on the evening of his return. It was 3 pages in her careful hand, and it said in detailed and articulate prose most of what they had been circling around in conversation for a week, what she felt and why she was certain of it, and what she thought the future might look like, not as a demand or a declaration of expectation, but as a simple offering of truth to a person she trusted with it. She said she was not afraid of hard things, and she was not afraid of the mountains, and she was not afraid of distance, but she was, she wrote, a little afraid of how much it had cost her to watch him ride away that morning, and she wanted him to know that. He read it twice, and then he sat by the fire for a long time, and then he went to the shelf where he kept a few sheets of paper for correspondence, and he wrote back. He had never been a man of many letters. His correspondence with his sister Mira was infrequent and brief, the letters of a man who found writing awkward and formal in ways that conversation was not. But this letter came without difficulty, in the same way that talking to Elara came without difficulty, as though she had found or created some efficiency in him, some cleared channel between thought and expression. He wrote about the mountains, he wrote about the quiet that had been sufficient, and then had not been. He wrote that he had been a man who believed he had everything he needed, and had discovered, quite recently, that this was not entirely true, and that discovery was one of the few times the land had surprised him. He wrote that he would be back in December, and again in February, and that the spring could not come soon enough. He sent the letter with the next supply rider passing through the area, and her reply came back 3 weeks later, and then his reply to that. And so through the winter, they wrote to each other with an intimacy and regularity that was, for a man who had spent 6 years in deliberate solitude, something very like a reconfiguration of his understanding of himself. He visited in December, and again in late January. On the December visit, he brought her a proper winter coat, heavy wool, lined with rabbit fur he had cured himself, made to her measure as best he could judge it from memory, which turned out to be quite accurate, which made her look at him with an expression that he had come to recognize as the particular combination of moved and slightly disarmed. She wore it immediately and kept it on for the rest of the visit with a satisfaction that had nothing performative about it. On the January visit, they had their first real argument. It was about Thomas, whose progress on the claim had stalled and who was, in Elara's assessment, making decisions about the mine's direction that were not supported by the evidence. Caleb had looked at the vein that morning and agreed with her privately, but had said to Thomas only that there were other considerations, and she had confronted him afterward about this with a directness that was the equal of his own. "You know I'm right," she said. "Right." I know the vein is running thin." "Then why didn't you say so? He trusts your judgment. He would listen to you. He would also feel that his sister had sent me in to argue for her position." "I don't need a man to argue for my position," she said, and the edge in her voice was clean and certain, and he felt the justice of it immediately. "I can argue for my own position. What I am asking is why you didn't say the honest thing when you had the opportunity." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I handled that wrong." She looked slightly surprised by the speed of the concession. "Yes," she said after a moment, "you did. I'll talk to him directly." "Good." She held his eyes for a moment, and the irritation was still there, but beneath it was something else, something that looked at him with the particular attention of a person assessing whether they can trust a thing completely. He thought she had just finished assessing that and reached a conclusion. He spoke to Thomas that evening, directly and honestly, and Thomas, who was a sensible young man beneath his silver mine optimism, listened and asked questions, and by the end of the conversation had come around to a modified plan that Caleb thought was considerably sounder. And when he and Elara sat by the fire that night, there was a quality to the quiet between them that was different from any previous quiet, the quality of two people who have had a difficult exchange and come through it intact, which creates a kind of trust that easier things cannot. Spring arrived in April, late as it did in the high country, and with it came the particular transformation of the Teton country that Caleb had watched 11 times now and never gotten accustomed to. The snow retreating up the mountainsides, the rivers filling with snowmelt and running high and clear and cold, the aspen groves going from silver to green in the space of what seemed like days, the whole enormous landscape shaking off its white stillness and filling with movement and color and noise. He rode to Callow Creek in the first week of April when the lower trail was clear, and he arrived in the morning to find her in the garden plot she had staked out behind the cabin, working the half-thawed earth with a determination that suggested she had been waiting for the ground to cooperate for some time. She looked up when she heard him, and her face did the thing he had been looking forward to for 3 months, which was the involuntary and complete expression of someone genuinely glad to see you. And she set down the hoe and crossed the garden to him, and he got off his horse, and they stood in the spring sunlight, holding each other for a long time. "I missed you," she said into his shoulder. "I missed you considerably more than I wrote in the letters," he said, which was saying something given what was in the letters. She laughed and leaned back to look at him, her hands still on his arms. "You look well." "You look better than well," he said, and meant it simply. Thomas had been right about the vein going thin, and over the spring he and his 2 partners had moved the operation from the original mine to a secondary cut that showed more promise. Caleb spent a week in April helping them re-timber the new entrance, which was work he found straightforward and satisfying. And the week had the quality of a life he had not been living but could easily inhabit. The physical labor of the day, the communal meals in the evening, and Elara moving through it all with the natural ease of someone who had found her place, who had looked at this difficult particular corner of the Wyoming Territory and decided it was home. One evening in that April week, he and Elara walked up to the ridge above the claim, while the light was long and golden and the mountains were beginning to show the dark green of the lower slopes below their white peaks, and they sat in the long grass that was just coming up through the last of the snow and looked at the valley below them. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. She had learned, over the winter, to hear the particular quality of his serious voice, and she was very still. "I have a cabin," he said, "and a view of the mountains, and a spring that runs clean year-round. and I have been, for 6 years, of the opinion that it was sufficient. He looked at the mountains. I'm not of that opinion anymore. He looked at her. I would like for you to be there, permanently, as my wife, if you'll have me. She was quiet. He waited. She had a right to take her time with it. Thomas, she said slowly, has 2 partners now, and the claim is established, and he doesn't need me the way he did last winter. She was thinking aloud, and he let her. And I have been. She paused. I have been thinking about this since January, if I'm honest. Maybe since November, maybe since the first morning after the storm, when we stood in the snow and looked at the mountains together. I know, he said. I have too. Yes, she said. I'll marry you, Caleb Holt. I'll come to your cabin in your mountains and your spring that runs clean year-round. She was smiling, and her eyes were bright in the evening light. Though I want to plant a proper garden. The ground in the draw is good for a garden, he said. South-facing, gets the light. I know, she said. I noticed. He took her hand. The mountains were going gold and pink with the last of the sun, and the valley below them was blue in its shadow, and the spring air was cool and clear and smelled of pine and snowmelt, and the particular freshness of the high country coming alive. They were married in June, in Callow Creek, in a ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who made his rounds through the mining settlements every few months. It was a small affair by any standard, Thomas, the 2 mining partners and their families, a handful of the settlement's residents who had come to know Elara over the winter, but it had a warmth and a rightness to it that had nothing to do with its size. Elara wore a dress she had made over the winter from good blue wool, practical and clean-lined, nothing like the elaborate fashions of eastern cities, but everything right for what it was and where it was. Caleb had cut his hair somewhat and shaved, both of which she appreciated, though she had told him the week before, with complete sincerity, that she had no objection to the mountain version of him either. Thomas walked her to the preacher, and his expression through the ceremony was the complex expression of a good brother, proud and wistful and genuinely happy in proportions that shifted as the words were said. And when it was done, he embraced Caleb with a grip that communicated more than he was the kind of young man to put into speech. After the celebration, which involved a great deal of Thomas's good cooking and the mining partners' apparently inexhaustible supply of fiddle music, Caleb and Elara left for the cabin. The ride to the cabin took 2 days, the same route in reverse that he'd guided her along in October, and it was so different, the trails clear and dry and green, the aspens full and trembling in the summer wind, the mountains showing their real faces without the storm's white concealment, that it felt like a different world entirely. She pointed out places she recognized from the winter crossing, the rocky overhang where they had made their first camp, the way station where she had first built a fire in his presence, and each place had the quality of a landmark in a story that had been leading here all along. He watched her see the cabin for the first time in its real light, not the dim emergency of a storm arrival, but the clear summer evening with the fireflies beginning at the meadow edge and the mountains enormous and gold to the west, and her face was everything he had hoped it would be. It's beautiful, she said. It needs work, he said, which was true. The winter had been hard on the roof and there was timber to replace on the south wall. It needs a garden, she said, looking at the south-facing ground below the window. That too. She stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked in at the familiar room, the rope bed, the table and 2 chairs, the shelves of supplies, the stone fireplace, and then she looked back at him over her shoulder. I think I'm going to love it here, she said, and the certainty in her voice was not the certainty of someone performing optimism, but the certainty of someone who knows their own nature well enough to predict it. I think you are too, he said. I think you already do. She smiled and went inside, and he followed her, and the cabin door closed on the summer evening. The first year of their life together in that cabin was a year of the particular happiness that comes from building a shared life with someone who is both truly known to you and continually surprising you. Caleb had thought he knew his cabin well. He had built it with his own hands, had spent 3 winters alone in it, had learned every creak and draft and quality of light, and he found that having her in it made him see it differently, see it through her eyes as well as his own. and this doubled perspective gave everything a freshness that was entirely unexpected. She planted the garden in a week of concentrated effort in late June, and it produced through the summer in a way that was a genuine improvement to the food situation, which had always been adequate and sometimes monotonous. She brought her books and stacked them on a new shelf Caleb built for the purpose, and the cabin acquired a literary atmosphere that sat incongruously and somehow perfectly alongside the hunting knives and trap chains and other equipment of his trade. She rode with him on the trap lines when the season came in November, which he had not expected her to request, but which she did, and she was a better rider by then and a better reader of the mountain country than she had been the previous winter, and having her alongside changed the experience of the work itself, made him see things he would have passed without comment, made him explain things he had never had occasion to articulate, and in the articulation of them, discover that he understood them better than he had realized. "How did the beaver dam get here?" she asked one morning, standing on the bank of a stream he trapped regularly, looking at the engineering of it with genuine interest. He explained about beaver colonies and territory and the ways water management worked in a mountain ecosystem, and she listened with that concentrated attention and asked questions that led him down trails of explanation he had never traveled with anyone, and he found himself thinking that the mountains were twice themselves when she was in them with him. She was, as she had said, not afraid of hard things. The winter was genuinely hard that year. The cold was sustained, and the snow was deep, and there were days when neither of them left the cabin except for necessary tasks, when the world outside the log walls was nothing but white and wind. But she moved through those days with a steadiness that matched his own, finding the rhythm of cabin life with the same ease she seemed to find the rhythm of most things that were real and practical. She read, she wrote letters to Thomas and to friends she had made in Callow Creek. She worked on the kind of domestic making and mending that was simply the continuous background work of frontier life. And they talked. At the end of every day, by the fire, they talked about the day's work, about letters received, about books she was reading and opinions she had formed, about memories and observations and ideas. He was still, in company, a man of few words. But with her, he had found the particular ease that comes from being with someone who does not require you to perform sociability, who meets you where you are rather than where convention expects you to be. He could be silent for 20 minutes, and she did not interpret it as coldness or distance, but simply as what it was. And then he could speak, and she was entirely present, and this particular accommodation felt, to a man who had been alone for a long time, like a form of extraordinary luxury. Thomas visited in September of that first year, riding up from Callow Creek for a week, and he and Caleb spent 2 days hunting together, while Elara ran the household with a calm that made Thomas confide to Caleb, in the understated way of a young man who does not quite have the emotional vocabulary for what he wants to say, that he was glad she had come west. "She's happy," Thomas said on the second day, watching the tree line for movement. "Yes," Caleb said, "she is." She was. In Ohio, the last few years, she was... Thomas paused. She was too large for the space she was in, if that makes sense. "It makes sense," Caleb said. "She always had been. Our mother used to say that Elara was meant for a life that didn't quite exist yet." Thomas glanced at him. "I think maybe she was right." Caleb thought about Elara standing in the snow at the cabin door in the October storm, small and frostbitten, and immediately concerned about her horse. He thought about her reading in his chair by the fire with her feet tucked under her, utterly absorbed. He thought about her standing on the ridge above Callow Creek in the spring light, saying yes. "Your mother was right," he said. In the second winter, Elara told him she was expecting a child. She told him on a November evening with snow falling outside and the fire high, and she told him in the direct way she told him everything, matter-of-factly, with a slight uncertainty in her eyes that was the only indication that she was not entirely sure of his response. She should have known him better by then, he thought. And then he thought that you never quite stopped being uncertain when you said an important true thing, no matter how well you knew someone. He crossed the room to her and put his arms around her, which was not his usual register of response, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Good," into her hair, which was an entirely inadequate word for what he felt, but was the one that came, and she laughed a little and held on. "Are you frightened?" he asked, genuinely wanting to know. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, which surprised him slightly. "Yes." "Good," she said, echoing him. "It means we're paying attention." The pregnancy was healthy and progressing normally through the winter, and Caleb found himself reconfiguring certain aspects of his daily existence with the same practical attention he gave to any change in the mountain environment, noting what was different, adapting to it, finding the new equilibrium. He built an extension onto the cabin's single room, adding a second space that was small but separate, with a proper window and a corner where a cradle would fit. He worked on it through the coldest months in the hours between the trapline and the evening, and Elara watched the progress with an expression that moved him more than he knew how to say. He wrote to his sister Mira about the baby coming. Her return letter was long and warm and included, between its practical lines, something he recognized as relief, the particular relief of a sibling who is worried about the person they love being too alone in the world for too long. She said she would come west to meet the child when the weather allowed, and he hoped she meant it. The baby was born in April, in the second spring of their life in the cabin, on a clear afternoon when the mountains were beginning to show green below their snowline and the creek was high with melt. Elara labored through the morning, and Caleb was present through all of it, which was not always the custom, but which was something she had simply assumed and he had simply accepted, being constitutionally unable to imagine waiting outside a door while she went through something difficult. The baby was a boy. He was large for a newborn. This surprised no one, and he arrived with a serious expression that made Caleb think, looking at his son's face for the first time, that the seriousness was familiar. "He looks like you," Elara said, exhausted and luminous and holding the baby with the surprised competence of someone who has never done a thing and turns out to be naturally good at it. "He has your forehead," Caleb said. "He has your frown." She looked up at him, and there were tears on her face, which she seemed unaware of, and he reached over and touched her face carefully with the back of his hand. "Are you crying?" she asked. "No," he said. "You are." He was. He did not attempt to argue the point further. They named him James, after no particular family precedent, but because it was a solid name that fit the solid fact of him. And James Holt grew his first months in the cabin in the Teton country with the mountains outside his window, and the sound of his parents' voices, and the particular quality of light that came through the south-facing window in the long afternoons of summer. Caleb's sister Mira came that September, as she had promised, and the visit was the healing of something long left to scar. She rode up from Cheyenne with her husband Daniel and their 2 boys, who were 7 and 5, and who were immediately fascinated by the mountains and by their enormous uncle and by the baby in roughly equal measure. Mira was a woman of 30 who looked like Caleb in the face and was utterly unlike him in temperament, warm and expressive and given to strong opinions stated without hesitation. And she and Elara took to each other within the first hour with the speed and completeness of 2 people who recognize each other's register. He watched them talking around the table in the evening, Mira holding James while Elara poured coffee, and the men talked about mining and weather on the other side of the table, and he felt the particular fullness of a man who has been given considerably more than he expected and is beginning to understand it. "You look different," Mira said to him at one point, catching him looking at his wife. "Different how?" "Less like someone who lives alone in a mountain." She said it without apology. "More like someone who belongs somewhere." "I always belonged somewhere," he said. "You always lived somewhere," she corrected, with the gentle precision of a sibling who knows you very well. "It's not the same thing." He thought about this. He thought about the 6 years in the cabin before the October storm that had deposited Elara Voss on his doorstep, the trap lines and the seasons and the mountains and the sufficient quiet, and he thought about everything since, and he thought about what belonging actually required. It required someone to belong to. It required the specific gravity of another person's presence, the way they organized the space around themselves, the way they changed what a room felt like and what a day meant. He had been a man of the mountains, self-sufficient and capable, and genuinely at peace with his solitude, and he had also been, though he would not have known to call it this, incomplete, not in the broken way, but in the way of something very good that could nonetheless be better. Elara had made him better, not by changing him, but by knowing him. And that knowledge had changed him in the ways that real knowledge always changes its object. He spent 3 days with Mira's family, the best 3 days in recent memory. And when they left, he held his sister for a long time, in the way that neither of them had been raised to be comfortable with, and both of them had grown into anyway. And she said nothing but held on, and that was sufficient. Life in the Teton country through those years had its difficulties, as the mountain life always did. The winter of 1876 was the hardest since Caleb had been in the mountains, and there were weeks where the cold was so intense and the snow so deep that the trap lines were largely unworkable and their food stores became a matter of genuine calculation. He was not worried for them. He had prepared well and knew how to manage the provisions, but the severity of it was notable, and the two of them were together in the cabin for long enough stretches that the quality of the person you were confined with became a more important consideration than usual. She was, he discovered, excellent to be confined with. She did not become anxious or restless or irritable in the prolonged way. She found the rhythm of the situation and moved inside it. She read, she wrote, she worked on the practical making that was always there to be done, and she engaged with him in the conversation that had been continuous now for 2 years and showed no signs of flagging. Some evenings she read aloud. She had a good reading voice, clear and measured, and she knew when to let the text breathe, and he sat and listened while James slept and the snow worked against the walls, and he thought that this was the thing he had not known to want, and having it was a thing of such ordinary, extraordinary completeness that he could only hold it quietly. In the spring of 1877, she told him she was expecting again. 2 this time, she said, and looked at him with the expression she used for things that required his actual emotional registration rather than his practical response. 2 children? He had understood her immediately but wanted to be certain. 2 children, she watched him. The doctor in Callow Creek says he's fairly sure. They run in my mother's family. He sat down, which was not his usual response to information, but felt appropriate. He looked at his hands. He looked up at her. She was watching him with that clear-eyed directness that had always been her most characteristic quality, giving him room to have whatever reaction was real. "All right," he said. "Then we'll need a bigger extension." She burst out laughing, the full genuine laugh that meant something had relieved her, and he stood up and went to her, and she was still laughing into his chest when he held her. He built the extension through the spring and summer of 1877, working longer hours than usual, with James following him around the building site at a toddler's determined pace, occasionally getting underfoot in ways that Caleb managed with a patience that Elara observed from the window sometimes, the large man and the small boy, with a feeling she could not have put into words but which she knew was something she would carry for the rest of her life. The twins arrived in September, a boy and a girl, which Elara said was the most symmetrical possible outcome, which made Caleb say that the land was not generally in the business of providing symmetrical outcomes, which made her say that she was choosing to take it as a good sign regardless. They named the boy Henry and the girl Clara, after the horse who had gotten them here. "The horse that got us here," Caleb said when she suggested it. "It's fitting," she said simply. Clara was the beginning of all of this. It was fitting. The mare was still alive, 11 years old now and semi-retired from serious work, living in the expanded lean-to that had become a proper small stable, tended by Elara with the particular affection of someone who had never forgotten what she owed. Thomas came for the twins' arrival and arrived the day before, which was fortunate, because the labor was faster this time, and the doctor from Callow Creek arrived with only an hour to spare. The births were healthy, and Elara came through them with the same steadiness that characterized everything she did, though, by the end of it, her steadiness had used up most of its reserves, and she slept for 12 hours with the twins in the cradles on either side of the bed, and Caleb sitting in the chair watching all 3 of them breathe. Thomas sat with him for a while that night, and they drank coffee in the quiet of a cabin that had 3 sleeping people in it, and Thomas said, not looking at him, "I used to worry about her. In Ohio, I used to think she was going to spend her life being extraordinary in a space that had no room for it." "I know," Caleb said. "I don't worry about her anymore." Thomas looked up. Whatever else I didn't know what I was doing when I came out here, I got that one right. You did, Caleb said. I'm grateful for it. Thomas went back to Callow Creek in October, and the silver vein had indeed proven out deeper than the surface readings had suggested, and the claim was beginning to show real returns. He wrote in November to say that he had met a woman, a schoolteacher who had come from Vermont the previous spring, and that he intended to ask her to marry him, and would Caleb think him very impulsive to do so after 6 months of knowing her. Caleb wrote back that 6 months is more than sufficient to know what you know, and that the length of time spent on a decision is less important than the quality of attention given to it. He showed the letter to Elara before he sent it, and she read it and looked at him with those warm, direct eyes and said, "I agree completely. Send it." Thomas married his schoolteacher, whose name was Margaret, the following spring, and they made the trip up to the cabin for a brief honeymoon visit in June, and Caleb and Elara provided a hospitality that was generous and unceremonious and deeply warm, and the four of them sat outside in the long summer evening after the children were down, the mountains blue and enormous against the sky, and talked about nothing particular and everything important. And it was one of those evenings that settles into memory as a complete and self-contained thing, a thing that doesn't need to be part of a larger story to justify itself. James was 4 years old that summer, a serious and curious child who had, as Elara had predicted early on, a great deal of both of them in him, the physical seriousness of Caleb, the intellectual curiosity of Elara, and a particular combination of independence and affection that seemed to be his own invention. He had taken to following Caleb on the short-range tasks around the cabin with a dedication that was touching and, sometimes, complicated, and Caleb had adapted to his son's presence with a patience he had not known he possessed until it was required. He was teaching James, that summer, to read the mountain. Not formally, but in the way of all the best teaching, which is the gradual sharing of attention. Look at that track. Look at the way the snow bent the branch. Look at how the bird moved when it heard us coming. The child absorbed it with the ease of a young mind that had grown up inside the thing being learned, and Caleb felt, teaching him, something of what Elara had said about finding the shape of the thing more clearly in the explaining of it. Clara the mare died in the autumn of 1878, peacefully in the stable, of old age. Elara found her in the morning and came back into the cabin and sat quietly for a little while, and Caleb let her sit, knowing what was wanted was not comfort of the verbal kind, but simply the company of someone who understood that some losses are small in scale and enormous in meaning. She was the beginning of everything, Elara said after a while. She was a good horse, he said. She was. Elara looked at the fire. I want to give her a proper burial. They buried her on the south slope below the garden, in the ground she had helped by her presence to make home, and the children were solemn about it in the way of young children who are old enough to know that a loss has occurred and not old enough to fully understand why it matters so much. The years settled into themselves. The cabin had become a proper small homestead, the extended structure, the stable, the garden that Elara had grown from a modest vegetable plot to a considerable producing operation, the outbuildings Caleb added as the years accumulated practical requirements. The trapline continued to provide the primary income, supplemented now by the occasional guide work he still took on, and the mountain years had given him a reputation in the territory as a man you wanted if you were going into difficult country. He had twice guided survey teams for the federal government through the high passes and had been paid well for it, and the money had gone into the cabin and the homestead and the children's future, with the practical forward-looking attention that Elara brought to everything financial. They were not wealthy, and they had no ambitions toward wealth, but they were entirely secure in the particular way of people who understand what they need and have it. The mountains provided game and timber and clean water and the clean cold air that was its own kind of sustenance, and they worked with the land rather than against it, and the life they had built was one that fit them the way a good coat fits, not ornamental but true. Thomas and Margaret had 2 children of their own by 1879, and the claim at Callow Creek had become a genuine going concern, and the extended family that had grown up around Caleb and Elara's improbable beginning was by then so natural in its shape that it was difficult to remember a time before it. They visited back and forth through the year, the children growing up knowing each other, and Mira and Daniel came again from Kansas, and the gathering in that September was a thing of such warmth and noise and good food and argument and music that the cabin and its extension were barely able to contain it. In the evenings of that September gathering, after the children were down and the conversation had reached the quieter register of late night, Caleb found himself sitting outside the cabin door in the cool September air, looking at the mountains dark against the sky. And Elara came and sat beside him with a blanket around her shoulders, and they were quiet together for a while. "Do you remember what you told me?" she said. "That first night." "I told you several things. You told me I could stay or go out there and likely die." She said it with a smile that was audible in her voice. "You made it sound like a straightforward practical assessment." It was a straightforward practical assessment. It was also the most important thing anyone has ever said to me. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, though I hated you a little for it at the time. "I know," he said. "You were very polite about it." She laughed, and the sound of it went up into the dark air, and the mountains were enormous and indifferent above them in the beautiful particular way of things that do not need you to exist, but give you something tremendous in the fact of their existence. "Caleb," she said. "Yes." "Do you know what I was thinking that night, when you said I could stay or go out there?" "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that I was very glad there was a door in front of me, that someone had had the foresight to build a door in this particular place in these particular mountains." She paused. "I was thinking that I had been going the wrong direction for a long time and hadn't known it until I was standing in the right place." He held her close. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were, as they always were at this altitude in this air, remarkable in their number and brightness. He thought about the 6 years before her. He thought about a man who had told himself he was fine and had been telling himself a half-truth for a long time, and about the storm that had come and stripped that half-truth away along with the snow it brought, and about the woman who had knocked on his door in the middle of it. "I said stay or die out there," he said. "You did. I meant it practically." "I know you did." She looked up at him. "But you were the one who couldn't just stay the same after that either. Were you?" He looked at her. In the dark, with the firelight from the cabin windows warm against her face, she was exactly herself, the woman from the storm and the woman from every morning since and every morning to come, fully known and continuously surprising, which he had come to understand was what love was, not the resolution of mystery, but the ongoing and generous revelation of it. "No," he said. "I couldn't. The mountain man who told me to stay," she said quietly, "was the one who changed, not just me." "Yes," he said. "That's right. Was that so terrible?" He thought about the cabin before and the cabin now. He thought about James's serious eyes and Henry's loud laugh and Clara the Younger's habit of climbing things she had been explicitly asked not to climb. He thought about the garden and the books on the shelf and the letters from Mira and the evenings by the fire and the way the mornings looked now with her in them. "No," he said. "It was the best thing." She settled against him more fully, her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the mountain dark with the stars overhead and the mountains beyond, and the warm, breathing, beloved fact of their life together inside the cabin behind them, and the Wyoming Territory held them in its enormous indifferent beauty, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The next morning was bright and cold, the first real suggestion of the autumn that was coming, and Caleb was up before dawn as always, and the fire was going and the coffee was made when she came to the table with her hair loose, as it always was in the mornings, and sat down and wrapped both hands around her mug. And across the table, he looked at her with the same attention he had given her on the first morning, in the storm, which had not diminished in any particular over the years, but had instead acquired the additional depth of everything known and everything still to know. James appeared from the children's room rubbing his eyes, and then Henry at a run, and Clara following more carefully in the manner of a small person who has learned that the big people sometimes have coffee at the table, and it is better to approach gently when this is the case, and the cabin filled with the particular noise of a family morning, the specific, unrepeatable texture of this life in this place at this time, And outside the window, the mountains rose white and certain into the blue Wyoming sky, and the creek ran cold and clear down the draw, and the autumn light came through the south window golden and warm, and everything was, in the way of truly good things, exactly as it should be. They built a second stable that fall, and Caleb acquired 2 new horses, and Elara's garden was harvested and stored and already planned for next year. Thomas and Margaret brought the children up for Thanksgiving, and the meal Elara and Margaret produced together filled the extended cabin with a smell that was the smell of abundance honestly earned, and the 2 families around the table were the result of a story that had begun with a storm and a knock on a door and a man's flat voice saying, "You can stay or go out there and die." The man who had said it sat at the head of his table in the mountains he had made his life, surrounded by everything he had once believed he did not require, looking at the woman across from him who had known from the first that you could not confuse what you needed with what you had trained yourself to expect. He had been the mountain man who built a door in the right place in the right mountains. She had been the woman with the sense to knock on it, and neither of them, in all the years since, had ever been anything less than grateful for the storm that had brought them to the same door at the same time, and the particular stubbornness of 2 people who had, in their separate ways, refused to be less than they were until they found the person who made being fully themselves feel not only possible but inevitable. The winter came that year as it always did, with snow that buried the familiar world and made it new and entirely itself all at once, and the cabin stood in its draw with the fire inside and the family inside and the mountains around it unchanging and enormous, and the trap lines ran through the white country, and the spring would come again as springs do, and the life that Caleb Holt had believed was complete and then discovered was only beginning was complete now in the real way, which is to say, in the way that is never finished, always adding, always deepening, always finding in the next morning and the next season and the next child's voice some new reason to understand that this, here, this, these people, this place, this fire, this woman across the table whose name was Elara and who heard him, who had always heard him, was what he had been building toward all along without knowing it. He had told her to stay or die out there. She had stayed. And he, who had been the one who knew the mountains and the storms and the right and wrong of things, was the one who had been changed beyond any previous reckoning. And he was grateful for it every day of the life she had made with him, and he told her so on a morning in November when the first snow of the new season was coming down outside the window, and the children were still asleep and the coffee was hot between them. "Thank you," he said. She looked up from her mug. "For what?" "For knocking," he said. She held his eyes across the table, and the smile that came was the fullest and most complete version of the smile he had first seen standing in the snow outside the cabin before he left for Callow Creek that first spring, the smile of someone who has said a true thing and had it received truly. And she reached across the table and put her hand on his, and outside the snow fell clean and quiet on the mountains, and the fire burned, and the world was exactly as large and exactly as good as it had always been. And the story that had begun with a storm and a stubbornness and a door was not ending but simply continuing, as the best stories do, into everything that comes next.